We're looking at Introduction to Biblical Counseling, and today we're starting a new section, lesson 14, on gathering information and clarifying statements. Last class we talked about the elements of the counseling process, and we just kind of introduced each one of these to you, and now we're going to be doing complete lessons on some of these areas. And today we're primarily going to be looking at gathering information. We realize that this is an important part of the process. If you remember from our last class, we mentioned Proverbs 18, verse 13, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly to him." And we don't want to answer a matter before we hear it. We want to make sure that we have gathered all the information we need to help in that particular area. And so what we want to talk about today is ways in which we can gather information to make sure that we have heard the matter before we actually answer it. First main point on your notes there is methods of gathering information. Now, one of the things that we gave you in a previous session was this personal data inventory, and you might even just turn back to that and put a little marker in that place there, because we want to refer to that a little bit more specifically today and how we use that piece of information. But one of the things that we encouraged you to do was to give out that personal data inventory to someone to fill out before they come and see you. And so you have a certain amount of information that you have gathered from that. And then hopefully you're going to get that before your first session, so you have a chance to look that over, because what you're going to probably want to do is take a look at some of the areas that are covered in this personal data inventory. And in certain cases, you're going to maybe want to ask some clarifying statements, or clarifying questions to help understand a little bit more specifically in some of those cases. There are certain categories in that particular questionnaire, for instance, that deal with previous marriage or termination of employment, where they ask you for some kind of an explanation, and you might want to get a little bit more information on that. Now, I'd like to kind of walk you through some of the main areas of that personal data inventory to kind of help you focus on the right kind of things when you're looking at those particular categories. If you'll notice on the first section, it deals with things like health information. Why does this make a difference in the counseling process, and what are we looking for here? Maybe even from the answers that they've given you. But first of all, we need to be aware that there are several things that can affect a person's attitudes and actions relative to the issues of personal health. There are people who are maybe on medication of one sort or another that might be experiencing a number of side effects that can either cause exaggerated or abnormal responses. And it's good to find out if they are on any kind of medication so that you know about this. And perhaps that may be part of the reason for what they're going through. You know, I find that some people who have been on long-term medication have just done so. My wife and I knew this one lady. It was part of her side of the family, is one of their friends, and she had been diagnosed with a certain type of psychotic or behavior, and she had been prescribed a drug that made her kind of like a semi-zombie throughout her life. She was able to cope with life and able to deal with life. You know, before that she'd had a problem with drinking and so forth. But I mean, in terms of engaging her in a conversation, it was like she was kind of staring at you, you know, through numbed eyes, you know, and that's the way we knew her. That's the only way I knew her, because I came into the setting a little bit later in life, and that's the only way I knew her. And for years, that's the way she was. And she just kept getting the same medication. Well, as it turns out, she was misdiagnosed at the very beginning of that, and for those years, she went through life kind of numb. And she had a new doctor, new situation. Turns out she didn't even need medication. And when they took her off of the medication, things started to improve, and she was a completely different person. I need to turn off this unit here. We have a terrible hum in that. And so sometimes, you know, these medications that they might be taking can affect how they're acting. Now, it's oftentimes very similar to people who are going through various changes of life. I know people joke about things like PMS and other things, but sometimes when a woman is going through menstruation and so forth, there can be different kinds of things going on in them that have to do with chemicals in the body that sort of change situations at times. Sometimes there's people going through life change or other things that can affect. My people, as they get older, they go through things like menopause and other things, and they can actually affect a person in many different ways. I mean, just like a person going through puberty at times, when you understand these things, you understand there's hormonal things that are going on in the body. Sometimes it has a bearing on what's going on during that time. I tell people, young couples especially who are getting married, I encourage them not to have a baby right away. I tell them to usually wait 2 years or so till they get a little married, a little further along. And part of the reason is because when a woman gets pregnant, it changes the way she is. And anybody that's been around a lady who's pregnant, you have to be a little bit more patient. You have to be a little bit more gracious, and take things into account. We have a wonderful pregnant lady here today who's never been affected by any of this. But there are women out there who have. And I knew, even my own son, he and his wife figured out that they got pregnant on their honeymoon, So, I mean, that's about as early as you can have a child. But what happens is that as that woman goes through those hormonal changes, her attitudes, her actions, and things become different. Now, there's jokes about, having a new taste for things, like going and get pickles in the middle of the night or whatever it might be. But it isn't just about taste and those kind of things. It's about many kind of things. And so what happens is that if a married couple gets married and they have a child right away, and the wife all of a sudden starts going through these changes, the man begins to assume this is what married life is all about. They really haven't had a kind of a normal year or a normal 2 years before all of a sudden this change. When you had a normal year or 2 years, and then all of a sudden this change, you understand this is pregnancy, this will pass, we're going to get over this, and we're going to get through this. And it's easy to tolerate and have a lot of patience. But if you don't know and don't understand these things and don't have the natural, normal thing to compare it to, it's easy to say, well, if this is married life, I don't want any part of it, And so the same is true in so many other areas. Health issues can have a big bearing on what's going on in people's lives. And so you start finding out, okay, what, and these kind of things, and you might want to find out more details. The second one here has to do with religious issues. And it asks some questions about religious background and so forth, and those things can also be helpful to you. The information gathered here will tell you to what extent Christ is the Lord or the center of their life. You're dealing with Christians, but you all know there's different kinds of Christians out there, and you determine that somebody, yeah, I'm a Christian, yes, I'm part of this church. When was the last time you were here? Well, 6 months ago. I know that there are people in this church who would consider this their church home, but I haven't seen them in 3 months. And if I would call them and ask them, which I've done in some cases, they would say, well, it's just we've really been hectic lately, and we've had this, and we've had that, and we've had the other thing. Now, that isn't the way I live, and that isn't the way I've ever lived. The doors of the church are open, we're there, and kind of a thing. But not everybody is that way, and not everybody lives a life where Jesus is really at the total center of their life. Not saying that church attendance alone is a barometer of that, but it is one of the barometers of that. And sometimes it's good to know because it will give you insight into maybe what they are lacking in certain areas. Maybe they don't have the power to overcome certain areas because they're not taking full advantage of all the spiritual tools that are available to them in Christ. We talked about this earlier. Maybe they do need to get water baptized. Maybe they do need to get the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Maybe they do need to get more plugged into the thing called the body of Christ, which is supposed to be able to be a tremendous resource to supply what is lacking in them, but they aren't even around the body of Christ enough to be supplied what is lacking. And so it may give you a clue into some of those things. Perhaps you perceive that maybe they're not taking advantage of those things, and maybe you're determining from these initial things that maybe they're not even saved, maybe they aren't even evangelized. There are some people out there who believe they're Christians, but they're not. And so the focus of your of your counseling might change a little bit to more of a evangelistic message rather than some other things. So that's one of the reasons for that. Then we got marriage and family issues. You know, sometimes how couples initially met and got married can give you insight into the foundation on which their relationship is built. Was it built on a physical attraction or intellectual compatibility or some other common denominator? What was it that drew them together? That will often tell you, because if it was primarily a physical relationship and physical attraction, they may have trouble with issues of communication. They may have trouble with some other kinds of things in their life by virtue of the fact that it was really mostly just a physical attraction that brought them together. And that will help you to understand who they are and what kinds of issues might be part of that counseling process. You might have to help them put a new foundation under their marriage. Maybe they never really learned what it was to develop on a friendship level or a brother and sister level. And if they have been, if they've been married before, sometimes when that previous marriage fell apart for whatever reason it did, it was never really, the lessons were never really learned from it. And it can oftentimes, when there's been a previous marriage and now second marriage, how many know that the second marriages actually fail more than first marriages do? And so people that get married for the second time think, well, we're solving our problem, but actually they might be taking problems into this new relationship if the previous marriage has not really been sorted out a little bit. We take people as they come, obviously, and so we have people who have been married 2 or 3 times at times who come into church, but the main thing is that we're learning from the past and not repeating the sins of the past. What sometimes can happen, if you were in a bad marriage and maybe you had an abusive husband or whatever it might be, and now you come into the new marriage, if that old situation was not handled properly, you'll come into the new marriage with a chip on your shoulder towards men in general, and your own husband will maybe actually reap some of the venom that really is supposed to be directed at the other guy. And the way you relate to each other might be based on some of this past experience. And so you're bringing old baggage, if you want to call it that, into this new situation. And so knowing some of these things can actually be a help to you. And so some situations where people have been married before, you might want to actually find out a little bit more information about that and how long it was between the 2 marriages and so forth. And if there had been a lot of infidelity and so forth, then trust might be a real factor in this new relationship and so forth. So marriage and family issues can be important. Number 4, there is parenting issues, deals with children and so forth. And the relationship that one has had to parents, their own parents, can have a significant impact on how one lives their life in the present. Now, we can't get to the place where we blame everything on our parents. I mean, it was my mother, it was my father. I know that can happen. But the truth of the matter is, our parenting and the kind of parenting that we had can have a bearing on certain things. It can cause people to be overly critical or careless or protective or sensitive about certain key issues. The role relationships of parental figures can also have a bearing on expectations in relationships. Here's a good example. A young lady, she comes into a marriage, and her dad is like the jack of all trades. He is like, he can do anything. He can fix anything. He can repair anything. He can build anything. He can solve any problem. He is just that kind of a, And she marries this guy who, he never lifted a finger in his entire life about anything. They were raised in the lap of luxury, and he doesn't know how to, if his sock has a hole in it, he doesn't know what to do. He knows he has dirty clothes, but he doesn't know what happens to them from that point. They just arrive back in his drawer. He lives that kind of a life where I really don't know how anything works. Now, that girl coming into that marriage is going to have the expectation that her husband can fix anything because her dad can fix anything. And then she's going to get really frustrated when, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do this. I'm sorry. Or procrastinating about repairs in the home or whatever. My dad would have been on that just like that. My dad would have been on. Well, see, her expectations in her marriage are carried over from a previous relationship, and sometimes you can't expect that. I remember one particular situation where, and you know, men and women's roles in relationships are so different depending upon the people. Like when my wife and I first got married, I did almost all the cooking. And I don't do that anymore, but when we first got married, I did, because she never cooked, never learned how to cook, and that type of thing. But I remember one couple I was talking to, they came from a family, the woman came from a background where the man did all the yard work. Now I know here a lot of times people hire that done, but in the States it's not necessarily so. You do most of your own work, and so mowed the lawn and trimmed the bushes, and we did the flower beds and all that kind of stuff. And she came from a background where the husband, he just loved to work in the garden. That was one of the ways he reduced stress. Well, the man came from a family where the woman did the garden work. I mean, she loved the garden, and so the husband never did anything. So when they got married, the garden never got done, and both of them were mad at each other because they had this expectation, by virtue of how they were raised, that the other one would be doing it. The woman came from a background where the man did it, so she was expecting the man to. The man came from a background where the woman did it. He was expecting her to do it, and they weren't really talking or communicating, and before you know it, they were both mad at each other, and they all both felt they had good justification for it. They're just simply not doing their job. But you see, we haven't sorted out role responsibilities in this new relationship, and so some of these expectations from parenting can come into that new relationship. Now, I've just given you simple, easy type things, but there can be other aspects to that will have a bearing possibly on the counseling process. Number 5, vocational issues. A person's vocational history can tell you a lot about a person in terms of their ability to work with other people. It can tell you about the ability to focus and commit themselves to long-term projects. A person who has a shaky employment history can also cause a certain amount of insecurity in those that they rely on. And so you look at that, and they haven't had a job for one whole year at a time. You know, it's just one job. So it tells you a little bit about a person. Also, it can tell you a little bit about why there might be some financial insecurity in the home, and financial pressure, of course, is a big problem. So some of these things can tell you some things. You're gathering information and all of these little bits and pieces. Now, this won't be true on a lot of them. Some of them you'll just scan right through, and there won't be any issue that you want to raise at all. But if there are, it's important to ask some maybe follow-up questions to some of those things. So one of the ways to gather information, the first method is using the personal data inventory. The second way is by asking direct questions. Lots of times in life, you can't really do this. You don't have the license or the liberty to do this. People would consider you to be too nosy and so forth. But when the people come to you for counseling, they give you kind of a license to ask them very pointed and very direct questions. And there's some great value in doing that. Number 1, there are some core questions that will help you get started. These come from J. Adams' Christian Counselor's Manual. He gives a list of 6 of them here, and we'll amplify these a little bit. Here he lists 6. What is your problem? What is your problem? You know, you can ask these in lots of different ways. What is your problem? What is your problem? What is your problem? What is your problem? You know, you just got to be careful where you put the emphasis. But what is your problem? What have you done about it? What can we do, or what is your expectation in coming here? As you see yourself, what kind of a person are you? Describe yourself. That's always interesting to see how people would describe themselves. How would you describe yourself? If you were introducing yourself to another person, what would you say about yourself? That would be helpful. Letter E, what, if anything, do you fear? Is there any other information that you think we should know? These are from J. Adams, and we'll talk about some of these, because there are, number 2, there are follow-up questions to these that will help us dig a little bit deeper. As we ask these questions, oftentimes they'll trigger other questions in our mind. When they give us an answer, and we might want to ask another question. Sometimes being a counselor at this stage is kind of like being a reporter trying to dig to the bottom of a story. And one question kind of lead to another one, which leads to another one. Now, we want to be careful here that we don't start feeling like we got to have every single detail of their life, or we'll be there forever. But when you sort of sense that you're striking oil here, and there's something that's might be a contributing factor to what their problem is, you want to dig a little bit deeper. Not all questions will be deemed worthy of follow-up. Some, however, will be followed up because you want to get a bigger picture. Here's a couple of examples. The question 1 that we gave before, what is your problem? This is kind of what their perception of their problem is as they come to you. So the counseling may give you an answer as what they perceive their problem to be. Here are some of the follow-up questions that you might ask them for a little bit more information. So they tell you what their problem is. And then you might ask, what makes you feel this way? What makes you feel this way that this is your problem? Sometimes the way they answer that question is very, very interesting. Well, others have told me that, or I arrived at it by my own self, or this or that. This happened and that happened. This seems to happen continually, and I guess it's just a matter of reading the handwriting on the wall or whatever it might be. So what makes you feel this way? Another question might ask, has anyone ever told you this was your problem? And they say, well, yeah, my mom would always tell me this. My teachers at school told me this. My coach in basketball told me this. This is what told me. Well, okay, well, we got quite a good list of testimony here that this could be your problem. And then you might say to them, well, what did they say? What did they actually say to you? Well, they pinned a note on my shirt and sent me home and says, this child cannot learn, which is what Einstein's teacher did to him, by the way. This pupil cannot learn, so you just never know. But people label, what did they say? Or another question, do you think that they were accurate in what they said? Because lots of times we have this testimony that's been given about us, but we haven't really accepted it. And maybe we shouldn't accept it. But why have you accepted it, or why have you not accepted it? What are the symptoms of this problem in your life? And you might, well, this is what I'm lazy. Well, what are the symptoms? Well, I lay on the couch all day long, or I do this, or I do that, or the other thing. And then have you always had this problem? And that's important to know, because sometimes people haven't always had the problems. Well, no, it seemed like it started such and such a time, or, yeah, I've always had this problem ever since I can remember. Well, those also give you cues as to how you might be dealing with that problem. And then when did you first start to realize that you had this problem? So all of these kind of things. Sometimes when you first started to realize you had this problem, sometimes those things can be tied to an actual event in their life, or a person that came into their life, or some other kind of, well, as soon as I started hanging out with that guy, then this thing started happening. Well, okay, that gives you some clues again as to how that might affect the solution to the problem. So once you feel you've exhausted the first question, you can move to the second question and treat it much the same way. The second question was, what have you done about it? And so they might talk to you about some of the things that they've tried themselves. You might ask, well, why did you do that? What have you done about it? Well, why did you do that? Well, and then you give the reasons why. Well, this so-and-so suggested this to me, or well, I just figured this would be the best way to handle it, or I read a book, and this is what the book said, and so why did you do that? Do you feel that it helped or hindered you when you did that? And so that can kind of help you again to discover exactly how much benefit they got out of it, or maybe no benefit. If it did not help, why do you think it did not help? Well, it didn't help because I didn't follow it. I got this book on a diet, and it was working fine along with it. But I ran into trouble here, and I ran into trouble there. So the truth is that some of the things that they may have done up to this point have actually maybe even complicated the matter rather than solved the matter. But also some of the things that they have done maybe are clouding some of the real issues that are there. I liken it a lot to when I was a mechanic, and when people would bring in a motor, or I used to do a lot of work on electric motors, DC electric motors, and they'd bring in a motor, but they tried to fix it themselves first. And usually we charge more for that. If you try to fix it first, we usually charge more for that. It's like when I buy a used car. I don't want them to detail the engine. I don't want them to clean everything up. I want to see it just like it was, because that will give me clues as to what might be the problem. But if you try to clean it all up and take away all the grease and all this kind of stuff, you're going to hide or mask what the real problem is by virtue of what you attempted to do. And sometimes when people have kind of taken things into their own hands, they've read this book and tried that and tried this, you can't really tell exactly what's going on. And so sometimes it's helpful to find out what they've tried in the past, because you might have to go back and unravel some of that stuff. Question number 3, what is your expectation in coming here? Important question. Some of the follow-up questions can be, well, what makes you feel that it will be different this time? You've come for counseling. What makes you feel it will be different this time? Well, it's interesting to hear what their answers might be. They would say, well, you know what? I recently had a fresh encounter with the Lord, and I just feel like there's hope this time. Okay, that's a good answer. Well, you know, you're just smarter than anybody else I've ever met, and I just feel like you could probably do this when nobody else could. Watch out for that person, because they're flattering you, they're buttering you up, they're stroking your ego, and in all likelihood that's the same thing they told to the last person that they saw. But what makes it different this time? What do you feel you will do different this time? What do you bring to the table that's new this time as opposed to what you've done before? And why have you chosen to come to me or to the church for counseling? And hear what they have to say about some of those kind of things. And again, they can give clues as to where they're really coming from. The truth is that some people are not actually interested in what you have to offer. They just want a support system around them. We've talked about that before. So in addition to using a logical progression of questions, it's important to follow up on the leading of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes the Holy Spirit, I have found in counseling sessions, will lead you to ask a question that's just totally from left field. It's totally off the wall. It's totally out of context. Jesus did this sometimes, and it was like the shock factor. You're asking all these questions, and then suddenly you throw in a question that's just totally unrelated to anything else. And they're used to just answering very truthfully, and sometimes you catch them by surprise, and they'll answer a question that they probably would have been more guarded about had you just ask it right off the bat. And again, I'm not saying here I can give you a list of those questions, but I'm saying that sometimes the Holy Spirit will lead you to ask a question that will be like Jesus when he sometimes asked the crowd a question, and it was just kind of, wow. It exposed the heart right away, because that's ultimately what you want. You want to try to expose the heart, because that's the thing that, above all, has to change before you can get anywhere else. Okay, so we're talking about methods of gathering information. One was, of course, the questionnaire that we had. Now we're talking about asking some important direct questions. Another thing that you can do to gather information is by observing body language of the people that are involved in the particular session. Body language includes things like, number one, the pitch or the tone of their voice. Usually a high-pitched or rapid speech can be indicative of tension or whatever. Noticeable change in facial expressions or posture when you're talking through various things, especially if you have a couple. One's talking, the other one's kind of starting to get real nervous, edgy, move around a little bit. Their facial expressions, their posture begins to change. They start slouching in their chair and crossing their arms and doing all kinds of things. Number 3, they're crossing arms and legs at significant times. And number 4, the occasional sigh and groan. So as you start to observe what people are saying and when they're saying it, you can. I've stopped people before. Okay, just a second here. You just groaned. When he said that, you just groaned. Why did you groan there? Oh, I didn't know. Why did you groan there? And what were you saying with that? So sometimes you can pick up on that. Letter D, being observant in sessions. Part of picking up information is being observant. For instance, when you got 2 people there, one person is continually interrupting the other person. They're continually they won't let them finish a sentence. Have you ever been around a couple like that? One of them. It could be the man or the woman. And another one is where they're apparent domination of one party. You can ask. I can be in a session sometimes where I can ask a man a question and his wife will answer, or vice versa. And no matter what question I ask, the opposite person to who I'm talking to will always answer. I said, just a minute, I'm asking them. But it tells you something about that relationship. when you start to see that kind of behavior. And then body language of the listening party, the person that's listening to the other person talk. Are they kind of like they're rolling their eyes and they're kind of ignoring what they're saying? Oh, here we go again, and she's going to tear me down, you know. And that body language will, again, be something that you're logging as part of the information that you're gathering. And then letter E, practicing keys to good questioning, I think is important here to understand how to formulate your questions in such a way as to get the most out of them. Number one, avoid yes and no questions. That is, are you happy today? Yes. Are you sad? No. You want questions that are going to require a little bit more of an answer to them, and so you're going to be asking why questions or what questions or so forth. What do you think about questions? Rather than just things that require only a yes and no response. Number two, ask specific questions that require specific answers. Again, trying to avoid generalities. Number three, let new questions arise from previous answers or statements that they have made. So one kind of leads to the next. Number four, make sure that the timing of the specific question is appropriate. Obviously, you have to kind of wade into the water gradually and to make sure the timing is appropriate. Number five, ask the same question in different ways to check out the authenticity of the answer. Sometimes people will answer a question there. It's a guarded answer. You'll ask them maybe another question, but it's really going to dig for the same thing, and they might give you a slightly different answer. Sometimes, obviously, when people are talking to you, they will lie to you, and sometimes by asking them a similar question in a slightly different way might evoke a less guarded response. Number six, ask relevant questions that involve their past, the present, and plans or concerns regarding the future. Relevant questions, relevant to the issues and the problems that they're facing. Number seven, be aware of the person's social standing and ask questions in a manner that gives respect to who they are. Not that we aren't all important, but you know, when you are working with someone who is the president of the country, or Nelson Mandela, as opposed to just a friend that you see on a regular basis, you're going to talk to them in a manner that's befitting of who they are. Otherwise, you'll get them on edge for the wrong reasons. Not saying that everybody doesn't need to be treated with great respect. They do, but you understand what I'm saying here. Letter 8, use carefully constructed questions to interrupt rambling and get the counseling back on track. One of the things that will prolong the counseling process is when counselees start to kind of get to rambling and going on and on. And sometimes you'll have to kind of pull them back and then give them another direct question that will take them in the direction you want them to go. So these are just some of the things that will help you in gathering information. The second part of gathering information and asking questions, though, is Roman numeral 2 here, and that is the importance of listening. Listening skills are very, very important while you're in the counseling process. And as you all know, letter A, listening involves concentration. Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is, I hate to say it this way, but while you care about what they're saying, you don't care about what they're saying the same way you would care about what your wife says or a close friend says. And sometimes, you know, if you are doing counseling on a regular basis, it can become a bit of a chore at times. And so what can easily happen is that you can kind of do things that are kind of just sort of, well, this is what I do. And you're not really focusing. You're not really listening to what is being said. Have you ever been with somebody who you could tell they really weren't listening to what you said because they asked you the exact same question twice in the conversation, and you realize they didn't even hear you the first time you answered it? Well, we don't want that to be part of the counseling process, and one of the ways that won't be is by the fact that we are concentrating on what we are saying, what they are saying. Now, the truth of the matter is it takes less time to listen and understand than it does to speak. You understand what I'm saying? It takes less time to listen and understand than it does to speak. So if David over there is telling me something, my mind is probably way ahead of him. He's not got all the words out before my mind and understanding is, I've got the gist of what, I know where you're going, I've got the gist of it. And so what that means is that your mind actually has some time on its hands. And what it will do with that time on its hands is you'll your mind can start to wander or start to think about other things, even while somebody's talking to you, because you think you kind of know what they're saying, or your mind is kind of racing ahead. So that means that you have to really focus your attention. Number one, under concentration, it involves paying careful and undivided attention when they speak. And I find the best way to do this, we'll talk about taking notes a little bit later, but the best way for me to just really make sure I am listening really carefully to what they speak is I rarely ever am talking to anybody in counseling that I don't have a pad in front of me and a pencil, and I'm taking a little bit of notes off of what they're saying, even some summary statements, so that when the counseling session is over, I almost have minutes of what was being said. And some of those will be important later on, as we'll see as we talk about those things later. But I think that often helps me just kind of stay with exactly what they're saying. Number two, it involves maintaining good eye contact with a person. That is when you're not taking notes. Good eye contact. This means removing physical obstacles that can hinder it. You know, got a big vase full of flowers sitting in the middle of the table. You need to move that aside, or a lamp that's in the way. You need to be so you can actually see face to face, and that's going to help as well. Number three, it involves minimizing distractions. That is, things like cell phones, pagers, outside noise, and visible other things. Sometimes if you're in a place where there's a large window that kind of looks out. My office in Portland, I used to have a window that looked out over. You could see the airport. You can see all the airplanes landing, and so it'd be very easy just to kind of stare off into space there. But you want to make sure those distractions are removed so that you can focus. Number four, it involves maintaining an appropriate distance from the counselee, not too close or not too far, kind of like an arm's length away, where you can be in sort of a contact with them. Number five, it involves the counselor minimizing talk about him or herself. What you don't want to do is get in a situation where you treat this just like you would an average conversation with somebody, where there's a lot of give and take, where they're telling you about themselves and you're telling them about yourself and all that kind of stuff. And the purpose is not for you to give them your life story. The purpose is for you to get the information that you need to help them. And so you want to minimize how much you talk about yourself. It's not a time for the counselee to ask you a lot of questions and for you to go on and on about this and on about that. I had a similar experience myself, and you can kind of get to the point where you're just having a conversation. So listening involves concentration. Letter B, listening involves maintaining a positive climate for disclosure. You want to make sure that the setting that you're in, the climate that you're in, is conducive to them opening up and being completely honest and sharing their all with you. Number one, this includes giving responses that demonstrate interest. This is sometimes referred to as active listening. It's like what we want you to do when you're listening to sermons and so forth. A few amens here and there. It's not just good for the preacher, it's good for the listener, because it forces you to kind of be engaged in what's going on. I'm sure you've all had this experience. I just had it the other day. Somebody called me and they were talking to me, and I went for a long time without saying, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I see. I was just quiet. And they'd say, are you there? Are you there? Are you there? They thought well, you know how cell phones are. Sometimes they just cut out on you, and you weren't sure whether it cut out or whether you're still there. And sometimes you'll hear a preacher say, are you guys still there out there? Well, what they mean is, I haven't heard anything from you recently. And I think the same is true when you're talking to somebody in the counseling process. You're just constantly engaging them by, making some, I understand, right? Yes, I see. And making little statements like that, which let them know that you're engaged in what is going on. Number two, this includes maintaining non-threatening voice tones. Sometimes I think that people, if they talk a certain way long enough, they don't even hear themselves and how they come across. Whether they're talking to their children or they're talking to somebody else. I had this one minister friend that whenever they got into a culture that didn't speak English, it's like they raised their voice, shouted, and spoke slower, And I told him one time, I says, speaking louder and slower doesn't help a person if they don't understand the language. or they'll go into a culture that, is different than theirs, and they'll tend to talk down to people. They'll talk to them like they're a bunch of little kids, and yet they're very, very intelligent people. And you just got to be careful how you talk to people in terms of your voice tones and so forth. You will antagonize people. This is why sometimes the Bible says a soft answer turneth away wrath, but sometimes sometimes we maybe tease about how maybe a psychologist or something might talk to people, but there is a certain soothing tone that is conducive to people opening up and sharing with you. And then there are tones or qualities that you can't have a civil conversation with. And sometimes in marriage this happens. One party or the other starts raising their voice, and as soon as that happens, guess what? All quality communication ceases from that point on. And so maintaining non-threatening voice tones. Number 3, this includes the physical comfort of the participants. Make sure that the setting is comfortable because this is going to be for 45 minutes to an hour. You want to make sure everybody's comfortable. That means they got a comfortable chair, posture. You got a beverage. We always try to offer somebody something to drink. Tissues handy if necessary. Good room choice, a sense of good ventilation, relaxed, not a clinical environment, cold, informal, so forth. Try to make it a little bit more conducive to being relaxed and casual in the conversation. Letter C, listening involves minimizing negatives that threaten disclosure. So on the one hand, we want to have a climate that's conducive for disclosure. We want to minimize negatives that threaten disclosure. When you do any of the following, you stifle the openness and the honesty of the counselee. Number 1, this means that we never interrupt the counselee in mid-sentence or mid-thought. Now, when I say never, there are times when you do interrupt the counselee. But as a rule, you're trying not to interrupt them. Let them finish their sentence, let them finish their thought. There are times when I might interrupt. I've already told you about a couple of those occasions. If they're talking rudely to another person, or they've just said something that maybe needs to be clarified, we'll talk about that. But you want to make sure it's very purposeful on your part and not just kind of a matter of the way you're talking. Because the more you interrupt a person, the more it causes them to pull back in the kind of sharing that they do. Maybe you've been around people that are constantly interrupting all the time, and after a while you just say, well, it's not worth the effort to try to get something said around here, and so you want to be careful of that. Number 2, this means that we do not correct, challenge, or dispute with them while they are answering our question. If you have something that you want to challenge about what they've said, this is why you're taking notes. You'll make a little note of it. You'll come back to that a little bit later. But in the meantime, go ahead and let them finish the thought. Maybe you want to take up an issue with what they're saying, but don't get into an argument right there. Number 3, this means that you do not make judgmental statements, especially in the information gathering stage of the counseling process. There's going to be plenty of time for you to talk about your judgment of what they've said, but in the meantime, you want to let them kind of vent and don't just kind of react to what they've said. Just go ahead and let them let it out at times. Number 4, this means that we do not make statements that reflect impatience or disgust on our part. You've all maybe been in situations like that where people, by what they say, can either cause you to be more open or less open. For instance, if somebody comes to you for counseling and you say something like, well, what is it this time? That's not conducive. Or, I can't believe you would do that. Or, that was a stupid thing to do. Or, when will you ever learn? Or, I told you this would happen. Well, those kind of things are not going to inspire people to be open with you. It'll kind of shut them down. And so you want to try to avoid those things that kind of reflect impatience on your part. Number 5, this means that we do not feel like we must adjust every misstatement or poor word choice. We need to focus on the intent and the meaning, not the phraseology and the wording. And I think when you start nitpicking people about every word, no, you're trying to get a general feel for what's going on here. And again, you don't like it whenever you're trying to make conversation and somebody feels like they got to adjust every word or word choice that you happen to use and it didn't have the right tense or didn't have the right this or that or the other thing. Number 6, this means that we do not reflect negative body language. While they're speaking to us, I mean, we've talked about the body language of them and maybe others that might be in the room, but what about your body language? Positive body language includes the following: nodding as opposed to nodding off while they're talking, good eye contact, good facial expressions, good posture, slightly forward in the chair, that's like eagerness to hear, expressing appropriate emotions. All these things say, I'm interested in you and what you have to say. Letter B, negative body language includes the following: nodding off or yawning, slouching, crossing arms, looking at your watch repeatedly. I think it's good to, if you have a counseling office, to have a clock in there that you don't have to look at your wrist to know what time it is. I know you need to be time sensitive sometimes, but I'll tell you what, if I'm in a counseling process, anytime I go like this and look at my watch, all of a sudden, are we out of time, or are we okay? It just creates a nervousness or nervous atmosphere. Looking away or staring off into space or playing with any object. You might have a little cap here like I do, and you're just kind of fiddling with it while they're talking, or a pen, you're playing with your pen, or whatever it might be. That all those things suggest I am not really interested in anything that you have to say. And finally, number 7, this means that we do not go overboard in giving positive strokes and thereby actually reinforce negative behavior. Sometimes we're so eager to give them positive feedback that we can actually kind of reinforce just this whole the negative behavior that they are involved in, and it's like, I'm going to get all this attention now by virtue of this counselor who's kind of doting over me. So we want to be careful about going overboard that way. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and close this session at this point. We'll pick it up here in our next session. We'll finish the good listening, and then we'll get on to the whole issue of clarifying statements. Okay.